I'm the guy who cooks the last meals for death row inmates. It's not the kind of job you dream about, but I took pride in it. Now, I wish I'd never heard of Norton Carraway. The most prolific serial killer you've probably never heard of either. His execution didn't just go sideways, it became a nightmare. And I can't shake the feeling it's all my fault. Carraway wasn't your run-of-the-mill murderer. The things he did were so grotesque, so sinister, that the people in power wanted the whole ordeal buried. They couldn't afford headlines about him botching his execution, or why. I had almost nothing to go on. Just the twisted scenes I witnessed in the gallery and the gnawing suspicion I'd played a part in the disaster. That night, I paced my apartment like a madman, replaying the events, praying for some kind of explanation that could clear my conscience. It started like any other execution. Guards marched Carraway into the chamber, his scalp shaved clean. He fought to die in the electric chair instead of getting a lethal injection. The irony wasn't lost on me. They strapped him in, locked him down. The executioner pulled the lever. Carraway convulsed, his body thrashing violently. I braced myself, waiting for it to stop. It didn't. The convulsions grew worse, and then came the screams. God, the screams. And the smell. Burning flesh is something you can't forget, no matter how much you drink. Before long, the prison staff yanked the curtain shut and hurried us out. We weren't told much, just that we had to leave immediately. I walked away knowing one horrifying truth: Carraway was still alive. The warden called me hours later, his voice stiff and strange. "We need to talk about Carraway's last meal," he said. My stomach dropped. My throat tightened. What do you mean? In person. I've never driven so fast in my life. If the cops had stopped me, I probably would have begged them to lock me up. The penitentiary looked like some derelict school wrapped in razor wire. Inside, it was eerily quiet. Guards stood around looking pale and jittery. The air felt heavy, like the whole place was holding its breath. Warden Paul Harris greeted me in his cramped office. He gestured to 2 steaming mugs on the desk. "Drink. You're gonna need it." I obeyed. Paul's face, usually soft and approachable, was haggard. His eyes were bloodshot, his shirt wrinkled. He slumped into his chair and asked, "Why'd you stay for the execution?" I hesitated. "A victim approached me," I said finally. It was the truth, or part of it. Rebecca Daniels. She showed up at my door. She wanted to talk about her daughter. Paul leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Rebecca Daniels? You invited her in?" She looked desperate, Paul. Skinny. Broken. Paul shook his head. "You know she was a suspect in her daughter's disappearance, right? A lot of folks in that town still whisper about her." "No," I said, genuinely shocked. "Back when Daniela disappeared, cops went to Rebecca's place asking for something the dogs could use to catch her scent. You know what they found instead? Runes. Dolls. Animal bones. She told them it was part of a ritual to bring Daniela back." I swallowed hard. They booked her on suspicion, but there wasn't enough evidence to hold her. "Still, people think she's dangerous, and I'd agree." He paused, studying me. "Now, about the execution. What happened?" I asked, though I already knew. Paul rubbed his face. "They cut the power after 20 minutes. By then, Carraway looked like something you'd pull out of a fire pit. But here's the kicker, he wasn't just alive. He was talking. Begging us to finish the job. My hands shook. How is that possible? Paul shrugged. Faulty equipment, maybe. I overrode his request for the chair and ordered the injection. He finally stopped breathing at 3:45. But we both knew that wasn't the end. Not for Caraway. Caraway was dead. Or so Paul said. I let myself relax a little in my chair, though I was careful not to let it show. Why'd you take this job, Kathy? Paul asked, leaning back in his chair, his tone a shade too casual. The question caught me off guard. My stomach tightened. Honestly? He chuckled humorlessly. I hate when you say that. Makes it sound like everything else you've ever said was a lie. I managed a weak laugh. I picked a terrible time to be a chef. Restaurants were shutting down everywhere. What was it, 25% of them went under that year? Something like that, Paul nodded. Any place still standing wanted a chef with years of experience, or they wanted me to sling drinks and wear one of those awful little uniforms. I shook my head. This was the only job I could get. Paul smirked. Cooking last meals has its perks. No bad Yelp reviews to deal with. Or repeat customers, I said dryly. The perfect learning environment, he quipped. Then his smile faded. But that was years ago. You're not some fresh-faced grad anymore. You've got the chops now. Plenty of places would hire you. So why stay? I hesitated, then gave him a partial truth. The challenge. You only get one chance to make someone's last meal. It's high stakes, you know. No other reason. None, I said, forcing myself to meet his eyes. Paul leaned forward, his face shadowed by the dim light from his desk lamp. You never messed with their food? Never thought about it? His words hit like a punch. My pulse quickened. What are you talking about? Paul's voice turned sharper, colder. The chair wasn't faulty. We had an engineer check it over. And after Caraway was finally pronounced dead, I ordered an autopsy. My hands gripped the armrests. What did they find? Paul's gaze pinned me in place. Daniela's blood. In his stomach, mixed with the food. The air felt like it had been sucked from the room. I'm asking you as a friend, Kathy. Did you tamper with Caraway's last meal? I didn't, I began. He cut me off. Think carefully. The state wants this whole mess swept under the rug, but there will still be an investigation. If they find out you've been doing, whatever this is, you'll be lucky to walk away clean. He paused, eyes narrowing. Was this some twisted sense of justice? Some vigilante crap? Like spitting in a rude customer's food but on steroids? Paul, you don't understand. I understand enough. His face darkened. I have to fire you, Kathy. Walk away quietly, and maybe, just maybe, the state won't make a big deal of this. Do we have an understanding? He thought it was just food tampering. He had no idea. Rebecca's face flashed in my mind, her hollow eyes and trembling hands. The vial she'd handed me. Execution is too good for him, she'd whispered. Feed him this, and he'll never find peace. Where had she gotten the blood? And why hadn't the electric chair worked? Before I could answer, a siren wailed in the distance. Paul frowned, muttering, "Prisoner escape." He grabbed his phone, but before he could dial, the door slammed open. A corrections officer stumbled in, his uniform soaked in blood. "What the hell happened?" Paul demanded, already halfway out of his chair. "It's not mine," the officer stammered. Paul's face hardened. "Then whose is it? Who's down?" "The coroner," the officer panted. Paul froze. "Wait. Then who's missing?" The guard's face went pale. "Carraway." My blood turned to ice. "What do you mean he's missing?" Paul barked. "His body is gone. So's the autopsy report. Looks like someone broke in and took him." Paul's voice dropped to a growl. "How many people were hurt?" "Half a dozen, maybe more. Some of them bad. I don't know if Hopkins and Clark will make it." "And you? You're okay?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Stay here and keep Kathy safe. Whoever's behind this is some kind of sick bastard." "Yeah," I said faintly, though I knew better. The guards never caught anyone. There wasn't anyone to catch. Later, I overheard one of the riot officers raving in the break room. He swore he'd shot Norton Carraway, his burnt, mutilated body, dozens of times. And that Carraway just kept coming, screaming in agony with every step. Paul didn't believe it. He preferred his own wild theory, that some shadowy agency, the one that had turned Carraway into a monster, had come to claim his remains for their own dark purposes. But I knew the truth. This wasn't the work of any agency. This was something much, much worse. I didn't go home that night. I didn't feel safe anywhere near my apartment, my kitchen, or anything that reminded me of Rebecca and her damn ritual. Instead, I sat in a cheap motel room, staring at the door, jumping at every creak of the building settling. Sleep wasn't an option. The TV buzzed faintly, tuned to a static-filled news channel. No mention of Carraway. No warnings about a blood-soaked corpse that had apparently come back to life. The silence wasn't comforting, it felt like a deliberate omission, as if the truth itself was too grotesque to share with the world. I'd been clutching my phone all night, but the screen stayed dark, no calls, no texts. I thought about calling Paul, but what would I even say? "Sorry, I accidentally cursed a mass murderer into eternal torment." As the clock struck 3 a.m., a soft knock echoed from the door. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Another knock, louder this time. "Kathy," a voice rasped. It wasn't Paul. It wasn't anyone I knew. But it was familiar. The hairs on my arms stood on end. "Who is it?" I croaked. No answer. Just a long, scraping sound against the wood, like nails dragging down the door. My stomach churned. "Go away!" I shouted, but my voice cracked. The scraping stopped, replaced by silence so thick it felt like a weight pressing on my chest. Then came the whisper. "You did this to me, Kathy." I staggered back, my heart racing. The voice was low and guttural, barely human. But I recognized it. Carraway. The door rattled violently. "You made me a prisoner in my own flesh. You fed me her blood. You thought you could punish me." The rattling stopped, replaced by a wet, choking laugh. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." I backed away, my legs trembling, until I hit the far wall. My eyes darted to the window. I could run. Maybe I could make it to my car, drive far away, leave all this behind. But before I could move, the lock clicked. The door swung open slowly, creaking on its hinges. The hallway beyond was dark, impossibly so. And then he stepped into the room. If you could call it stepping. Carraway's body was a grotesque mockery of what it had once been. His skin hung in charred, jagged pieces, revealing muscle and bone underneath. His eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. And the stench, burnt flesh mixed with something older, fouler, made my stomach lurch. "Do you like what you've made?" he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "You wanted me to suffer, didn't you? Wanted to play judge, jury, and executioner." I couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. "You've cursed me to endless pain, Kathy. And now you'll share it." He lunged. I screamed and threw the motel lamp at him, the cheap ceramic shattering against his chest. It didn't even slow him down. His hands, black and claws, really, wrapped around my throat, and the world tilted as he lifted me off the ground. "You'll never escape me," he growled, his molten eyes boring into mine. "Not in this life. Not in the next." Black spots swam in my vision. I clawed at his hands, but they were like iron. And then he stopped. His head jerked to the side, as if hearing something I couldn't. His grip loosened just enough for me to gasp for air. "They're here," he muttered, his tone almost reverent. Then he dropped me like a sack of flour. I collapsed to the floor, coughing and gasping, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. He backed toward the door, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by clumsy hands. Before he disappeared into the darkness, he turned to me one last time. "You can't outrun them, Kathy. They'll come for you too." And then he was gone. I don't know how long I sat there, trembling, before I finally found the strength to move. The motel room was empty, but the air still reeked of him. My phone buzzed on the floor, the screen lighting up with a message from an unknown number. "Run." I grabbed my keys and bolted for the car. I didn't even pack my things. I drove all night, not caring where I went, as long as it was far away from that town, that prison, that thing I'd unleashed. But no matter how far I run, I feel him. In every shadow, every creak, every whisper of the wind. He's out there. And he's not alone.